And so the case studies were really set up then to capture the main buckets of information that were useful for us and hoped that would be useful for others, which is basically to break an analysis of a charter management organization's model, in this case, into instructional. So we spent a lot of time, or FSG spent a lot of time looking at the instructional model of the school, which is the visual representation that we have here. We also looked at the operational model. So what is to run this academic model? What's required on the human capital side? What's required in terms of technology infrastructure? What's required in terms of professional development? All those sorts of things. And then what's the financial implication? So what does it look like up front to try to start one of these models? And then what are the expected ongoing costs that a model would occur? And what are also the potential cost efficiencies or financial benefits to a school that result from running a model in this way? So that's really kind of like what the case studies were set up to look at. And so when you think about questions that you may have, I would say anything along those dimensions, from instructional to operational to financial, we can totally go on any of the five. So Alliance is the first one that we'll talk about. They're really interesting. They are an existing organization. This is not a new startup organization. They've been running schools in Los Angeles for years. Generally speaking, their schools are high performing, and so they are considered a successful case study in Los Angeles. They were founded in 2003. Like you see, they were running, this is all as of last year, running 14 high schools and 6 middle schools. And what they decided to do was to pilot blended learning first in 2 schools and then bring it into a 3rd new school. And so what our case study did was followed the new school that opened up on what they call the BLAST model. It's just their name for their blended learning model during the 11-12 school year. And so this picture kind of gives you an idea of what the Alliance model looks like. So they were grades 9 through 11, I believe last year, and blended learning ran in almost all of their classrooms. So they were a classroom rotation or a station rotation model. And so what you see here is this idea that they had 3 different stations where the students would move from one to the other over time. And so the way basically that it worked was that the teachers created what they call a digital agenda, which basically gave the directions for each of the stations in question. So just to be, I guess, very specific about it, you might have had a group of kids back here, a group of kids over there, both doing their own thing. Let's call that one was the computer lab, so these students would have been online. These students would have been back in this back corner, maybe working on a project on their own. And then we would have had a group of students up front with a smart board and the teacher. Right, so kind of think about that orientation of a room. And so the digital agenda basically said, all right, here's the standard for the day. Here are the learning objectives that accompany it. Here's what is expected out of the direct instruction part of the class. Here's what I need you, the student, to do when you log on to your computers back there, which we're serving up the content that was asked of them. And here's what you need to accomplish during the time that you would spend in project-based learning. And so the 2 things to note really quick, and then I'll stop, about Alliance is that all of the learning stations were connected by that idea of a standard or a learning objective. So the notion was that what we were talking about up here was connected to what they were doing online, was connected instructionally to what they were working on in project-based classrooms, in their projects. The other thing that's really interesting just to consider about what Alliance did is at the same time that they did this, meaning changing the mode of instruction within a classroom, they also upped their class size. So their average class size, and these are high school kids, was a 1 to 48 ratio. So I would have 16 kids up here. There would be 16 kids online and 16 kids working on their own on a project. And so it sounds like a lot. I used to be a high school teacher, so when I heard that number, really. But if you think about where the teacher spent his or her time, if I'm a teacher, I only saw 16 kids at any one time. And so whereas my normal mode of instruction might be like, teaching a group of 30 kids, and I would be teaching them all at once, now I got to see them in 3 groups of 16. Yes.
Do they utilize teacher's aid with the students working collaboratively?
It's a great question. No, generally speaking, they didn't.
So how does kind of basic law and order work in a room like that?
It's a really good question, and feel free to.
Yeah, I think all of these schools have to spend a fair amount of time on that culture and on that transition, and they do. I mean, there's another model where you spend the first 6 weeks of the year really getting the students very used to this. And it's amazing, it is fairly self-organized, self-policing. When we were in the classrooms, we didn't see a lot of difficulty. I mean, the teacher, there's some demands on the teacher, and so you have to think about your human capital model, finding the right people who are able to sort of manage these three, and sort of have eyes in the back of their heads below that, and that's true in the classroom as well. But it didn't look like, it was pretty well maintained.
It does go back to culture though, and I think again, one thing that we have a very high interest in is figuring out how this looks in traditional district schools that may not always spend as much time on culture. And so I come from the no excuses charter world, and so for us it's culture, 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 literally for the first 6 weeks, and you have a culture. I mean, that comes, as importantly as instruction. And I think a lot of these folks, it was the same. It's what made it easier to try and innovate. It's what made them easier to push the envelope. It's what makes them able to say 6 months into the year, we're switching everything, flip the switch, we're going to change the way this looks. It's because they do spend so much time on that culture. So, and all of that is spelled out in the case studies, these kinds of nuances, because we want that to be clear. We want it to be able to say, this wouldn't be possible without this much time and energy focused on these other levers that make this work. But it's a great point. And the other thing that is interesting to note and read more in the case study and kind of talk about is, while the teacher is still only teaching 16 students at a time, those of you that have been in a classroom or worked in education, you still know, well, they have 48 times however many classes of kiddos that they're teaching AP English or whatever it may be that night to be looking at. And so that's where we're also in this world of blended wanting to spend a lot of time and energy on the LMS infrastructure, that's the learning management system infrastructure, way to get data from the online content into the hands of teachers in an efficient and effective way, things like that that are still sort of lagging. So there are a lot of moving parts in the space of blended that need to be improved. So while they may be only instructing 16 people, yes, that does mean they have a ton of data to look at night, and so that's another lift that we, as philanthropy and policymakers and stuff, need to think about and figure out how to make more efficient.
I'd add one thing about the alliance model that's interesting, which is they also have an element of a lab rotation where for an hour a day, the students go into a computer lab. And what's great about that is that students who need credit recovery can do credit recovery, and students who are more advanced can do advanced placement. So it's a way to further individualize instruction, as part of the school.
Any other questions on Alliance? And we can certainly come back.
Yeah, if you had a school, or did any of those schools have one-to-one computers where you had laptops and all that?
Some of them did. Alliance was one of them, right?
They don't take home necessarily, but they do it one-to-one. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Summit actually also, who we'll talk about in a minute, also does have a one-to-one. So they were all different. Is the answer to the question. And I think from a technology standpoint, there are pros and cons. To think about on everything, all dimensions, including cost, but also thinking about network reliability and things like that. I think First Line in particular would talk a lot about the issues of having laptops plus wireless. Plus software running off of a web system. You don't always have 100% uptime in that scenario because you can drop computers and things like that. So there's lots, I guess my point is there's a lot of considerations I think that go into the question of whether you want to do one-to-one and invest the resources or whether you want to go with computers that are fixed points in time and are fixed places and the students rotate.
Yeah, I was more interested in whether it was in any of these, this data set that you got built.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And all these.
Logistics part.
Yeah. Well, but to that point, all these folks would love to go one-to-one and would love to be in wireless buildings and love to have that. And to be honest, if you run the numbers, it's cheaper than what we're looking at here. But these are all. So we serve 75% or higher FRL, free and reduced kiddos, and some of these folks are able to build their own buildings, which is a byproduct of having blended schools, and some of these schools are trying to get old district buildings wired to be able to do blended learning, and those are the ones where First Line, for example, it goes down, so they actually can't have laptops. They have to buy expensive, infrastructure and servers and wiring and things that are kind of archaic, and we would not believe,
So is it fair to say that these blended models are more transitional toward that goal?
If they can, they would do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends, right? I think it probably, yes, I think a lot of them are oriented that way. I just think it depends on what are the series of trade-offs that you want to make, right? Like, I think a really key thing here is to be thoughtful about where you allocate resources, and it may well be that you say, you know what, we want to double down on, the upfront costs that would be required for a one-to-one, and we're willing to direct money away from other things to make that happen. Other people may make different decisions, and I think it just really comes down to where you want to place your bet, so to speak. All right, so keeping Alliance in mind, we'll actually go to First Line. First Line is a really interesting, these are all really interesting, so you're gonna hear me say that every time. I'll try to find different adjectives. First Line is really interesting. They are a charter management organization in New Orleans. So I should have said this up front. 4 of the 5 organizations that we studied are in California, the 5th in New Orleans, and that's where First Line is. They have been in existence for a number of years. They have 5 schools currently. Arthur Ashe has been a member of the First Line network for several years. So this, again, was not a new school. This was actually the purest example that we have in this cohort of a transformation or a transitional school away from what was a very traditional model towards a blended model. So we were talking earlier about, that it's important that you're crystal clear about why you're doing blended and what your intentions are. And if Jay Altman, who is their CEO, were here, I think he would say that they were really after 2 things. The first of which was how to personalize or individualize instruction for their students. And First Line has a very interesting, or Arthur Ashe, I should say, their K-8 school that they transitioned to blended learning, has a very interesting story, which is to say that they have a very high special education population. So I can't remember the exact numbers. I want to say it is 14% for the CMO, but Arthur Ashe was up around 25%, give or take. This is something that they do very well. New Orleans is a full choice system, and so they were seeing that people were electing into their model, which is great because they are good at serving special education students. The issue that they faced was that the model that they had developed to do this was a very high labor-intensive RTI model, so response to intervention. And what that meant was that they had hired lots of response to intervention specialists who were pulling students out into small groups and things like that as a way to individualize instruction in a human way and meet the students where they were. That had been working for them, but it was, like I said, very labor intensive, and it was resulting in a fairly high persistent per student gap from a funding perspective. And so their question was, what can we do to keep the spirit of what we're doing, but to put ourselves on a stronger path towards sustainability? And so they have a very interesting twist, and this is where we'll really spend our time, a very interesting twist on the lab rotation model. So this was a model where classroom instruction might be fairly traditional. To be honest, the case study really didn't go as much into what happened in the classroom, but sort of takes as a supposition that you have fairly traditional classrooms, but the students spend part of their day rotating into the learning lab. What First Line does here that's a little bit different is they bake their response to intervention time into the learning lab. And what that means, practically speaking, is that rather than having specific RTI instructors who come into the regular classroom and pull students out for RTI, the teachers themselves become the RTI instructors, and they go into the learning lab when their students are in the lab and pull students out themselves for RTI instruction. This is more efficient from a human capital standpoint. I think First Line would also argue that it's more efficient from a knowledge transfer perspective because I'm the teacher, right? So I know these tier 2 students really well, and I'm the one who's delivering that instruction, so it's keeping more information. It's more efficient, right, in terms of me understanding what they need, both in the whole class and in the RTI lab. At the same time, students aren't losing time in the regular classroom because they're leaving to go to RTI. This is happening during the learning lab. So it's an interesting way to think about how to use time and how to use people and how to kind of move them around the building depending on what you're trying to accomplish.